This is BBC Two and Newsnight.
3 days of air attacks and they're running out of targets. Will battle now be joined on the ground? Good evening from Washington. Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda organization issued a defiant statement just before we came on air, calling once again for a holy war against America. The US was today claiming some success in its air assaults against the targets in Afghanistan. Attacks are continuing tonight, but the focus could soon move to support for Afghan opposition on the ground. We'll ask the senior senator who's been with the US Defense Secretary what happens next.
In Afghanistan itself, there is, as far as we know, only one anti-Taliban force on the ground. Northern Alliance commanders claim military competence. We report from inside Afghanistan on whether they're right. How a minister's spin doctor thought she'd turn the World Trade Center tragedy to the government's advantage. And separated at birth, can the new Tory party leader make a fresh start, or is he destined to become William Hague Mark II?
The United States will continue to suffer terrorist attacks until it gives up support for Israel. That was the gist of al-Qaeda's rather chilling statement, which accused the Americans of being crusaders and said the World Trade Center bombers had done a good thing. America launched round-the-clock airstrikes on Afghanistan today, but just hours later, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld admitted they were running out of targets to hit. He said Taliban air defenses and communication systems had been shattered by 3 days of bombs and cruise missiles, but refused to comment on whether the US military would now aid any Afghan opposition offensive. Tom Carver reports.
Today, the Americans began daylight raids over Afghanistan. The Taliban's air defences, such as they were, have been effectively disabled, apparently. The Pentagon says it no longer needs the cover of darkness. But strike aircraft are starting to return to the ships with their bombs still on board. After 48 hours, they're already exhausting their list of targets.
We're not running out of targets, Afghanistan is. We will be gathering additional intelligence from the ground and through various intelligence assets that will enable us to seize targets of opportunity, and that means you have to wait until they emerge.
The Pentagon has shared its first images of battle damage. Both runways on this airfield in western Afghanistan were put out of action by Sunday night's raids. But other raids weren't so successful. 3 miles outside Kabul, they killed 4 Afghans working on a UN project in this building.
An office of the NGO Afghan Technical Consultants was hit during the bombardment of Kabul. The building was destroyed. Afghan Technical Consultants, which we call ATC, is one of the NGOs working under the umbrella of the United Nations Mine Action Program for Afghanistan.
With the Taliban in disarray, the next stage of the operation is to try to track down bin Laden and his henchmen. Not easy in a country the size of Texas.
Over the next 4 to 5 days, I've been told by senior military sources, they are going to isolate the areas where they believe Osama bin Laden is hiding. They'll use selective airstrikes to cut off all the tracks in and out of those areas and try to pinpoint his exact location on the ground from human intelligence. Only then will they send in the special forces, and it's a process which these sources say could take several weeks.
This al-Qaeda training camp was almost empty by the time it was bombed on Sunday. Finding up-to-date intelligence is an enormous challenge for the Pentagon.
Well, they're going to get human intelligence, possibly from defectors crossing over the border into Pakistan. What they're going to find out is probably where bin Laden was 48 hours ago or a week ago, but they're not going to be able to find out where he is now, and more importantly, where he's going to be an hour from now when they'll have the weapons ready to take him out.
So how do you get around that problem?
Well, the only way to get around that problem is to, I think the key factor is luck.
The other task now facing the Americans is to find a new Afghan government amidst the patchwork of warlords, private armies and tribal interests now fighting for power. The administration says it's not into nation building, but it may have no choice.
I don't think we want the Northern Alliance to become our only tip of the spear here. In other words, the people in southern Afghanistan don't necessarily support the Northern Alliance, which is a minority of Afghans. And as a result, I don't think we want them to take over the Afghan government any more than we wanted the Taliban to do that. But to the extent that they can assist us in disrupting the Taliban, putting pressure on them, tying down a lot of their forces in the north, that should make up the breakup of the South even easier.
If there is a power vacuum, America may have to put her ground troops in to maintain order. But it's an option no one is prepared to admit openly just yet.
I'm not sure what it would involve in terms of troops. My guess is that if we can get the Taliban dispersed and we can go after the terrorists, that the Afghan people themselves can take care of their own security.
The smiles were still present today when Gerhard Schroeder called on the president. But behind the scenes, the coalition is now asking how long all this is going to take.
There's one way to shorten the campaign in Afghanistan. And that's for the Osama bin Laden and his leadership to be turned over and so they can be brought to justice. We will have a sustained effort. But I want to remind you that this is a part of a larger effort. That our war, the war of freedom-loving people, such as the Germans and the Americans, is against terrorists as a whole.
Tonight, the air war continues, focusing on targets of opportunity. But unless they're very lucky, bin Laden is not going to be among them anytime soon.
Tom Carver. Well, the question of what happens next is a key issue for Arab members of the coalition. Earlier, I spoke to Senator John Warner, the senior Republican on the Armed Forces Committee, who spent 2 hours with Donald Rumsfeld, the US Defense Secretary, yesterday. I asked him where the ground forces are next.
I'm an old Marine. Boots on the ground are often needed, but it remains to be seen in this conflict. But you got to remember that this thing is a political war. It's an economic war. It's a cultural war. We're feeding the people. We're doing many things that hadn't been done before in military campaigns.
Also, today there was the question of Afghan opposition forces and any degree of support you might give to them. Is it possible there might be close air support?
Oh, clearly. You will find that to the extent that we can help them and able to achieve their goals, which is just repressing this terrible Taliban situation, that government, you bet we'll support them.
But might that also be with close air support as well as
I wouldn't try again
support?
to get into tactical things, but we're going to, indeed, Russia's supporting them. We should support them to the extent they're willing to take that support and do it on their own, all well.
The United States made it clear to the UN Security Council that the target may be broadened beyond Afghanistan.
May I say it was the United States and Great Britain, again, as partners that went before the Security Council. We have got to ferret out terrorism wherever it is in the world because it's a challenge to our security.
But what if that weakens the coalition?
Let's take one step at a time. The coalition is strong at this point. I commend our president for the ability to put it together with your prime minister. Take it a step at a time.
But if indeed the coalition was to balk at the idea of taking the conflict perhaps to another country, another organization, Richard Perle has also said, well, it doesn't actually matter. If the coalition feels we'll carry on.
I think keeping the coalition together is very important. But if there are other cells of terrorism that have the potential to strike out against the United States, Great Britain, or any other freedom-seeking nation, you've got to put them down.
So there wouldn't be unfinished business. I mean, does that mean you might have to hit Iraq?
You're suggesting things that I'm not going to answer. I don't know where those cells exist to the extent they're active and potentially able to strike at us.
There's been increasing unrest in Pakistan. How much is it very important to keep stability in Pakistan, if necessary, to reduce U.S. military impact?
That's a story of true heroism. The general who's in charge of that country at this time even though he attained that position through a coup, is handling this thing with tremendous courage. At the moment, yes, some street disruption, but by no means ready to topple the government.
If indeed the Taliban say that they're ready to have 2 million more martyrs, if necessary, in order to conserve their independence. You know, it's a beautiful sunny day here in Washington. It seems a million miles away from conflict. But if American soldiers, and indeed, of course, British soldiers and others, start to lose their lives, how are people going to look at this conflict?
As again, a survival of freedom. Let us not, at this point in time, suggest that we're going to run from anything. Our nation is strong. It is united behind our president, as your nation is united behind your prime minister. And we, together with the other coalition members, must take those actions, those risks necessary to stamp terrorism out.
And, you know, in your assessment, I mean, Donald Rumsfeld certainly said, you know, this is about a sustained campaign. In your assessment, is it years rather than months?
I wouldn't try and put a time limit on it. Why play into the hands of the terrorists? Keep them guessing. Remain resolute, remain strong, and take such actions as necessary.
Also, today there was a feeling that from the administration that there was a need to tighten the loop, who actually knows what goes on. I mean, you're clearly in pole position here. Is there a danger that too much information is getting out?
You know, I've been in this Senate 23 years, and I've served with many presidents. From time to time, regrettably, information does leak out. I don't know all the facts about this, but I was raised as a sailor in the end of World War II, and the old slogan, I think it may have originated in Great Britain, loose lips sink ships. We cannot allow that to happen. At the same time, it's very important in our form of government, where you have two co-equal branches, President and our Congress, unlike your form, that we remain informed so that we can be full partners with the President. Because if something goes wrong, we have to accept responsibility with the President, not skip and run from him.
Senator Warren, thank you very much indeed. Well, I'm joined now by Tom Carver again. We hear that the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan is speaking. What do we think he's saying?
Well, the top line that's come out, basically, is that he is saying he is disturbed by the idea of America attacking any other countries other than Afghanistan. That's obviously going to send alarm bells ringing in the White House. So you remember yesterday the White House sent a letter to the UN reserving the right of self-defense under Article 51 and hinting that they may want to take this war against terrorism elsewhere apart from Afghanistan. I mean, certainly the hawks within this administration believe very strongly that the mission, i.e. to wipe out terrorism, must not be put at the expense of preserving the coalition. It must be the other way round, essentially, that the mission is more important than preserving the coalition. The doves, particularly people in the State Department, are obviously trying to hold the coalition together. If you've got someone like Kofi Annan signalling concern, that's a worrying indication.
And signalling concern so soon into the military action. I mean, do you think it's because of what he sees as the bombardment that's taken place so far and how that might be extended?
I suspect it's because of briefings he's been getting from American officials outlining what they would like to do next. They're obviously already looking at stage 2. They know that they have to be successful or be seen to be successful in dissuading terrorists to operate. And the hawks believe the only way you do that is to discourage those governments from supporting those terrorists. That may mean military action. Kofi Annan's very worried about that.
But also the idea of the coalition is very much at the forefront of Tony Blair's mind. Are you suggesting that that might not have the same significance here in America?
I don't think it does. No, I think they're that much further away from the Middle East, and of course the attacks happened against America, and so it's that much more personal, and the desire to hunt down these terrorists is that much stronger, I would say, and gets weaker the further you go from these shores. And
what do you make then of the Al-Qaeda statement talking about the holy war against America to be, as it were, efforts to be redoubled in the attack on America, and also that the Twin Towers was a good thing? What's the significance of the timing of this statement?
Well, it's obviously upping the rhetoric, and it's the first major statement we've seen since these air campaigns began.
There was no indication in it really that it was made after these air assaults. It talked about generalized crusade by President Bush. It said, there was some pretty colorful language, it said that the attacks on Afghanistan will open a door that will never be closed. And it's obviously infuriating for the White House to see this being played again and again on all the American networks. It was what Mrs. Thatcher once famously called the oxygen of publicity.
Tom Kerber, thank you very much. Now back to you in London, Jeremy.
So, the most powerful air force in the world now feels relatively safe from one of the world's worst air forces. That was the easy part. The next stage, trying to unseat the Taliban, is another matter. As far as we know, the only anti-Taliban forces on the ground are the Northern Alliance, who claim that Taliban soldiers are beginning to defect to them. Convenient they may be, but the Northern Alliance is not representative of the country as a whole. Tim Hewell is in Hodja Bayadeen, one of their garrison towns in northern Afghanistan.
Business in Afghanistan is looking up as Western bombs continue to fall. One of the world's weakest currencies has doubled its value in the last fortnight. Before the airstrikes, you needed 140,000 of these Afghanis to buy $1 US. Now you pay only 70,000. The markets are obviously calculating that peace and a stable government may at last be on the way. Wholesale merchant Rahma Hoda can now import his stocks of cooking oil, soap and sugar far more cheaply. It's the first piece of good news he's had since he and his partner Wazi Ahmed fled from their hometown of Talakan a year ago as the Taliban advanced. Like thousands of other refugee tradesmen and businessmen, they're trying to salvage what they can of their former lives in this bleak garrison town on a dusty, drought-ridden plain. Almonds, dried mulberries and green tea are a reminder of the more gracious life Rahma Hoda and Wazir Ahmed used to enjoy before they were separated from their families.
I don't know how long the war will last. It depends on the fighting. I can't say. It's a soldier's question, and I am a businessman.
Outside the shop, I found a detachment of Northern Alliance soldiers riding high as they headed for the front.
In every family there are men who are ready to fight the Taliban, at least 2 or 3 in every family.
On the front line, Alliance commanders are already laying plans. General Mamour Hassan controls 5,000 troops. He says they'll be advancing on Kabul by next week.
For the next week, we'll be moving equipment up to the front line to get ourselves ready. After that, we will attack.
Alliance leaders believe they'll soon be pushing at an open door. They say dozens of Taliban officers and more than 1,000 men have already switched sides. But those with knowledge of life under the Taliban are more cautious. They say the Kabul regime may be defended to the last by the several thousand foreign zealots attracted to Afghanistan by Osama bin Laden.
It's hard for people. The Pakistanis are there, and the Chechens, and the Arabs. That's the problem.
As they prepare to engage the enemy, Northern Alliance leaders know that whatever happens, the success of their campaign will depend on the political alternative they can offer. People here remember Northern Alliance leaders fighting one another during their last spell in power in the early 1990s. But these men say the rivalries were manipulated by outside powers, especially Pakistan.
If it is as bad as it was before, the people of Afghanistan have a big problem. Pakistan was interfering like it is now. The conflict here came from them.
For the last 2 centuries, foreign meddling has cast as dark a cloud over Afghanistan as the country's persistent dust storms. Now, America's started what's supposed to be an intervention to end interventions. People here will be delighted, but amazed if that's true.
That was Tim Hewell. Earlier, I spoke to the Foreign Minister of the Northern Alliance, Dr. Abdullah Abdullah. I asked him whether, in his judgment, conditions in Afghanistan were about ripe for an assault.
I would say that conditions are getting right for such a situation, but I wouldn't say that that means that tomorrow we will launch an assault. We will consider different circumstances and conditions, but conditions are getting right.
Dr. Abdullah, there is a lot of anxiety about what will replace the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan. Is the Northern Alliance prepared to share power with other parties?
Of course we are. We were willing to share power with the others in the past as well, but the circumstances inside Afghanistan was such that 70% of the territory was under Taliban control, and also international opinion or in the international community, there wasn't much attention about Afghanistan. So the circumstances inside Afghanistan and outside Afghanistan was not suitable for such a situation. In post-Taliban era, of course, this is the most necessary thing to do, to share power with all ethnic groups. All ethnic groups should be satisfied in the future government of Afghanistan.
Well, you'll understand some people find that rather hard to believe, given your human rights record.
Of course, there have been a big campaign of disinformation launched by Pakistan in that regard. And of course, this also has to be reminded that for so many years, Taliban regime was portrayed as a regime which has brought stability and security to Afghanistan, and this was the position of Pakistan until the last minute before September 11th. And from the other side, Kabul, the capital, during our time was under siege by different groups. It was rocketed all the time, and there wasn't the right security situation in Kabul. And some human rights abuses might have taken place by individuals, but as a whole, the government could not be judged in that way.
But Dr. Abdullah, when you look at what happened when your forces took Mazar-e-Sharif, 2,000 people killed in reprisals afterwards. You're not seriously going to argue those are isolated individual acts, are you?
This was the Taliban forces which had launched an offensive in Mazar-e-Sharif and had massacred thousands of civilian populations. That could not be judged as a human rights abuses by any means.
Dr. Abdullah, thank you. I'm joined now by an authority on the region and the Northern Alliance, Robert Templer of the International Crisis Group. He's in Brussels. Robert Templer, the Americans are being extremely coy about whether, if at all, they're giving aid to the Northern Alliance. Do you think they should?
I think they probably have no option but to do that, given that there are no real good choices in Afghanistan. There's nobody in this country that you want to get into bed with politically or militarily. I think most sides are pretty much the same in the way they behave. I think Dr. Abdullah's vision of these human rights abuses are completely mistaken. When they occupied Kabul, the Mujahideen forces used to do such things as rape the inmates of psychiatric hospitals. These sort of things went on, unchecked, and in many ways the initial popularity of the Taliban was due to the appalling situation in Afghanistan under the rule of the Mujahideen groups that now make up the Northern Alliance. So none of these groups are particularly palatable, but in this case I think that they probably have no choice if they do want to get rid of the Taliban.
But just to be clear about this, they are really, you say, no better than the Taliban?
I think they are probably better in the sense that they might be more amenable to change in the future, but I have to say that these groups that are warlords essentially, that have been smuggling drugs, growing opium, carried out appalling human rights violations across the country. There are no groups within Afghanistan that you would really want to turn to form a government that would represent anything like the sort of governments that we would like to see there, but they may be the best of the worst choices there.
Now, when Dr. Abdullah says that they'd be prepared to share power with other groups, clearly that's a statement of realpolitik, because if ever they're going to rule Afghanistan at all effectively, they would have to command much greater support than they currently do command. Is that feasible?
Well, I don't think so at the moment. I think that this is a country with no state structure at all. Normally in these sort of situations, what you have is an interim government that maybe divides out the ministries among different factions. That's impossible in this case. None of these groups want to give up power by entering that sort of government. They have power because they have weapons and they control a small amount of territory. None of them really want to give that up to go into some sort of loose administrative coalition. So it's very hard to see how this coalition is going to come together, how it's going to run Afghanistan, given that this is a country with no state, no infrastructure, no institutions, and such a decayed state of existence that it's very hard to see how it would work.
Well, you do sound gloomy. I mean, maybe the mistake on the part of the coalition is to try to see it survive as a state. Perhaps it should just be left as a series of little statelets after all this.
Well, I think that would end up bringing in rivalries from around the region, which would make the whole region significantly more dangerous. You have to remember that all of the ethnic groups within Afghanistan have members of their population or support outside. And there are large numbers of Pashtuns in Pakistan, Tajiks in Tajikistan, Uzbeks in Uzbekistan, and large numbers of Hazaras who seek support from Iran because they're also Shiite Muslims. So in all these cases, the disintegration of Afghanistan would almost certainly create a more dangerous situation throughout the region.
What's the alternative then?
Well, I think you have to go with what you have at the moment, which is the Northern Alliance, and then this country is going to need a massive effort to rebuild it. You're really going to have to go in there with something akin to the Marshall Plan, but done in a different way. You can't expect there to be a state first and then rebuilding. You've probably got to rebuild first, then build the state, then build the sort of peace and the political system that you might want to see there. But you're really going to have to go in village by village and rebuild this country and create some education, create some hope, some prospects for these people, create some incentives for them to stop fighting. And that's something that's been lacking for really the past 20 years.
Robert Templar, thank you very much for joining us. Thanks. The Prime Minister flew off for a lightning tour of the Middle East this evening, another effort to strengthen the coalition. But he left behind an unsettling row about his party's spin doctors. Anyone who's ever had any dealings with this government will have been scandalised by the revelation that one of its ministerial advisers tried to exploit the tragedy of September the 11th for the party's advantage. Cynicism, the saintlier ministers tell us, is the stock in trade of the media. Imagine their mortification at it being made public that within an hour, a single hour of the World Trade Center catastrophe, at least one spin doctor was advising that now was the time to slip out potentially embarrassing announcements.
Appear to have been 2 explosions at this stage.
Everyone recalls where they were when they heard. This was an event so awful, so awesome, so horrific, that it's no exaggeration to talk of a state of collective global shock. But there was an exception. Within minutes at the Department of Transport, an email was being drafted about how to take advantage of the catastrophe.
Subject: media handling. It's now a very good day to get out anything we want to bury. Councillors' expenses? Joe.
Sure enough, the next day the government announced it was thinking about increasing expenses and allowances for councillors. No one noticed. The writer of the memo, Joe Moore, is a spin doctor personally loyal to the Transport Secretary, Stephen Byers. She's paid by the taxpayer. Her boss has form on slipping out controversial announcements, hoping no one will notice. In 1999, he released both the results of a DTI investigation into Jeffrey Robinson and also the funding plans for a controversial Turkish dam project 3 days before Christmas. The media ate their turkey and shrugged. But this is callousness and manipulation of another order.
This is not an error of judgment. I mean, this is not a failure of that kind. This is a failure that goes to the heart of how people think about their role in government and the political system. I mean, you have to just ask yourself, if it was a minister who had done this, I mean, not that it would be, but if a minister had done this, what would happen? We know full well what would happen. It would not be possible to survive, nor do I think should it be possible for someone else to survive either.
Once a colleague with a greater sense of decency had passed on her thoughts to a national newspaper, there was an apology forthcoming. But the accusation now is that what was suggested is exactly what the government then did.
The story about councillors' expenses was never going to be a big story anyway, and that's one of the aspects of the misjudgment of this email. And as we've seen through further announcements, there were much bigger fish to fry.
True, if you go down the list of announcements since September the 11th, there are hundreds of minor press releases. Who knows how many of these might have been front-page splashes on another day if any journalist had bothered to read them. Most certainly wouldn't. But there are others. There was the announcement that Sellafield was going to build a new plutonium reprocessing plant, thereby preempting the outcome of an entire review of the nuclear industry. That announcement had already been scheduled before September the 11th, so it could be classed just as some sort of good luck. But then there was the retreat from plans for the London World Athletic Championships for 2005. Abandoning a manifesto commitment would have been highly embarrassing any other time. Then there was the Prime Minister's announcement of a U-turn on student loans. It might have got a bit more attention if not for impending war. Not to mention the government published response to the BSE inquiry, which might as well not have happened for all the attention it got. And then, of course, just as the cruise missiles were being pulled from their silos, the government tipped Railtrack into bankruptcy. The allegation of manipulation is, by its nature, circumstantial. But according to one former Labour insider now in Blackpool covering the Tories for Guardian Unlimited, it's a more extreme version of business as usual.
Clearly, governments of all different persuasions clearly try to use times when people are looking elsewhere to get out bad news, as does business. This memo was shocking, it's surprising, the government is clearly embarrassed, but I don't think that Jo Moore will be losing her job.
Scepticism is healthy, cynicism is corrosive, and there is no cause for it.
The government has never been slow to attribute base motives to others and noble ones to itself. But it's hardly a revelation that the political classes are in reality more calculating than they like to appear to the public. This year's Labour conference started and ended in a respectful silence for the dead. From now on, they'll know that those kinds of silence are meant to be more than just symbolic. Neither Stephen Byers nor Jo Moore was available to talk to us about this tonight, and nor, as with just about every one of those announcements we listed, was anyone else from the Labour Party. And now to Blackpool, where the Conservative Party conference continues in blissful obscurity. Today it heard from the leader who promised the sunlit uplands this summer and then led the party into the valley of the shadow of death. Jeremy Vines there.
Jeremy, thank you. The obscurity seems actually to be helping them, strangely. One senior Conservative told me today the international situation has bought his party space and time. The space might be mistaken for a vacuum, but there is no shortage of people wanting to suggest which direction the Conservatives should go in. A phrase you hear a lot here is, we need to find our own Clause 4. It is not the fog of war, but the fog of election defeat that is refusing to lift here. Inasmuch as there is any clarity for the Conservatives, it is the knowledge of what they must not go back to. But the new leader had to answer a knock on the door today.
Morning. Hi, Jeremy, how are you?
Not because we were here, but because his predecessor had turned up to wish him luck. That created a first joint photo call, which must have made Mr. Duncan Smith's team roll their eyes. They want to stress the differences between the two men. What we noticed were the similarities. Mr. Hay, can you just tell us, are you going to be getting under the bonnet and helping with the relaunch?
I will assist the party in every way possible. I'll be right there helping Ian in whatever way he thinks is appropriate.
So as he said that, did his most famous speech come back to him?
Mr. Chairman, as a 16-year-old, I represent what may well seem to be the lost generation for the Conservative Party. By all accounts, some 10% of first-time voters voted Conservative in the last general election. If that trend continues, then perhaps some mathematician in the hall would care to work out just how many years it will be before it becomes impossible for the Conservative Party to win a general election.
24 years after that speech, it doesn't take a mathematician to work out that something big needs to happen for the Conservatives even to be in with a shout. Everyone here is seized with the idea that there has to be a new idea, but nobody is sure what the idea should be. However, the conference speakers have been creating a starting point of sorts, simply by trying to sound nicer.
We all know from our canvassing that too few families felt that we were on their side. And they don't believe...
While I am doing this job, you will not hear me making any general attacks on teachers or the teaching profession. That will not be.
I very much hope that the first black and Asian prime ministers of our country are Conservatives too.
Mr. Howard was once described by Anne Widdecombe as having something of the night about him. His whole party is now trying to have something of the day.
All sorts of areas.
But it is the policies, the ideology that count, and emerging as an early force in that department is the new chairman, David Davis. Aware of his reputation as a dangerous sports enthusiast, I understand he's been privately telling colleagues he wants the same approach to policy now. Not left and right, he's urging, but brave and calculating. And yet it is difficult to keep the past at bay.
She was willing to take a stand on principle before it was popular.
There is only one she, so even an event called Conservative Way Forward can start sounding like the way back. Some have better things to do than spend a week trying to untangle their party's future from its past. Love 40 doesn't even begin to describe the election result as far as these two Tory activists are concerned. So they're choosing to play tennis in London instead of attending the conference. For them, this is the real point.
We can't just rely on having a good suite of policies. Our policies at the last election were on the whole fine. That wasn't the issue. The issue was the tone of the leadership. It was a tone which didn't instinctively attract people to our party. And that's the challenge.
It did worse than that, actually. It turned them off it. It was often petty. It often came across as being vindictive. It came across as being mean-spirited. And I think our biggest challenge is to get back a heart as a party.
Until 1990. So would the Portillo agenda reignite them? Tonight his demand for rapid modernisation was driven home on the fringe.
We should stop condemning people who are born or who choose to be different. All Conservatives admire family values, but there can also be values and value in lifestyles and relationships outside the traditional family. And where we can define and identify such values, we should not be afraid to do so in our own way.
So there is a battle on now to define them as quickly as possible.
There are those who still take the view that somehow we should just talk about the economy, that we simply weren't right-wing enough, that we weren't trenchant enough in expressing our opinions. But actually I think the overwhelming majority of people at this conference, from wherever they come, have recognised that we simply have to become a more attractive party again. We have to live in the real world.
Mr. Duncan Smith and his predecessor are well aware of all that background noise. Some say the long-term answer here is a leader with the common touch, with a centrist approach and a consensual style. Then they pause and remember that was John Major. Well, I'm joined now by the newish Conservative chairman, David Davis. No attempt at this conference to launch a single new policy.
Well, no, what you've actually described in your clip so far is a party with a ferment of ideas, and they go right across the board, from the social agenda you heard Alan Duncan talking about there, to the sorts of things you didn't show me saying about public services, what we have to do on hospitals, what we have to do on schools.
But they take a lot, you accept they take a lot of bridging, because you've got, as you say, the socially inclusive people like that, and then you with your paean of praise to Margaret Thatcher today, which lasted about 9 minutes.
They're not mutually exclusive. I mean, after all, you're talking to a person who grew up in a council house or council estate and the son of a single mum. Hardly the sort of thing you're trying to paint me as, I suspect.
Well, they're talking, a number of people at least, Mr. Duncan Smith, Liam Fox, Michael Ancram, about going to Europe to see how they do things. Sure. Yeah. All you're going to find out is that they spend more money.
No, they're not. You're going to find that they use different methods. They use the private sector more. I mean, Ian Duncan Smith, during the leadership campaign, was talking about the fact that although Dutch schooling is all paid for out of the state, about 70% of it is actually private schools paid for by the taxpayer. That sort of thing may be useful. Similarly, in France, you see more use of the private sector in the health sector. They get much better healthcare as a result. What that means is that if you've got a cancer in this country, you may die, whereas in France and Germany, you live. And that's the key issue, not how you do it, what the result is.
That sounds exactly like Labour.
Does it? Does it? I mean, you've got... Look,
you almost used the same phrases that Mr Blair's used recently.
No, I didn't, because what we see with Labour at the moment is that they're pretending to use the private sector in health. What they're actually doing is just getting healthcare on the never-never, because they're not allowing choice, not allowing freedom to the doctors, not allowing choice to the patients, and therefore they're not using the private sector in the proper way.
But Mr Duncan Smith has talked about getting tax as a proportion of GDP down to 35%. How can that be your aim when the average European spend on healthcare is way above the British levels at the moment?
Well, what you saw today was Michael Howard talking about public services coming first. Now, the important thing about low taxes is they cause, or they allow, much greater growth in the economy, and that's actually what gives you the money to pay for the public services. That was actually the story. Since you're accusing me of looking backwards, that was actually the story of the Thatcher years. Lower taxes, faster growth, more money spent in the health service, and in education, and in fact more cut taxes.
So you're seriously suggesting you can go to the voters of the next election and say we're going to cut your taxes and spend more?
That wasn't what I was saying. I was just putting the point.
Well, is 35% still the aim?
I was putting to you that, well, there is no single number. It depends on the time. It depends on what the external economy is like. After all, at the moment, Gordon Brown is having to take into account all sorts of things that happened after September the 11th. And that means that he may have to make recalculations of how much he can spend, how much he can tax the economy.
But 35% is not the aim.
But that is true of any government. You can't set a single fixed point and say that's what we're going to tax it.
People said to me a number of times that I've been going around the Conference, the main problem with the Conservative Party at the moment is people don't like them. Actually, voters do not like Conservatives they see on television so very much at all. How are you going to change that?
Well, the first thing is to be relevant to what they care about. During the last election, most of us found on the doorstep that they wanted to hear about what we're going to do about the health care system, what we're going to do about education, what we're going to do about social services, what we're going to do about pensions. These are issues which are vital to people, what we're going to do about law and order, vital to people's daily lives. The first thing for a politician to be is relevant to people's daily lives. And if you've got answers to those questions, if you are concerned about those questions, then they will take you seriously and then they'll elect you.
So how did you manage to miss all of that over the last 4 years?
Well, I think what happened in the last election was perhaps we put too much emphasis on the euro, and we didn't put to the front some of the policies, actually rather good policies, that we had in the public services area.
And the euro has gone as an issue now for you?
It's not gone. I mean, our views on the euro are well known, but everybody else.
Stretch of opinion in the party is broader on that than almost anything else.
Actually, this party is probably more decided on the euro than any other, because it's actually had an internal referendum. Over 80% supported the leadership on the euro. The point here is the public at large.
There's no split on the euro.
Well, there's a split throughout the country, and there's a split in every party. When you get a Labour politician on here and start asking about splits in his party, I'll take that question seriously. What you've got now, however, is the public saying the euro is an issue for a referendum. It's not an issue for choice between parties. We've got to take that seriously. We've got to say, what is the issue of choice? It's about law and order, health, education, the economy, the nuts and bolts, the bread and butter issues of everyday life.
Mr Davis, thanks very much indeed. Well, we're joined now also by Paul Gray of Connect, a new lobby group within the party which is promoting a more inclusive approach, and also Olga Maitland here, who was MP for Sutton and Cheam. What do you think the priorities are now, Mr Gray?
Well, the priorities are, the party's united around those. Everybody is here talking about health and education. Everybody is talking about how we can basically reconnect, and it's an awful pun, but with the British public by telling them that our policies are about care and compassion. And I think what's gone wrong in the past is that we've come across as a party that knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. We've talked about tax cuts. Tax cuts are great, but what are they for? They're there to enable people to make better choices with their own lives, to get better services, and that's what we've got to focus on, is that the results of these tax cuts, the results of our policies, are based on the care and compassion that is underpinning the development of those policies. And if we can deliver that care and compassion as a message, people will trust us with the next stage, which is being elected and delivering the policies.
Do you think, Olga Maitland, that the Conservative Party should accept same-sex relationships on an equal footing?
Well, I think this is a fact of life. I mean, this is what's going on in the real world, and there's no point trying to fight that. I mean, I personally feel that the Conservative Party should be accepting and tolerant of this is the way modern life is. On the other hand, I also believe that we should say that family life, a married couple, is the best environment for children to grow up and to flourish, and there's endless evidence to support that.
Would you call it normal?
What, a normal family life, a married couple?
Well, would you say that was what is normal?
I would say that it comes within the normal lifespan, but there are other lifestyles. Yes, all right, except after all, people who lead minority lifestyles should not be excluded. And I don't believe they should be excluded. They're part of modern life. We don't feel uncomfortable with them. They're part of our world. They're here at the
But should your
conference.
policies encourage marriage?
Oh, yes. But
Well,
then
Ray,
they never
what do you
have
think of
been.
The Conservative Party's always encouraged marriage, but we've got to look at society as it is now, and many people don't live in a formal married life. They have different solutions, different ways of living. We mustn't victimise people or say that those old other solutions are bad or in any way morally reprehensible. That is just not the case. And most people in this country don't get hung up about this issue. This is not an election-winning issue. It's quite clear from this conference, it's quite clear from talking to everybody here, most of the Conservative Party are very relaxed about these issues. We don't want to fight on these issues, we want to fight on the core issues that matter to people, which are health and education. And if we move on to those and focus on those, we're very clearly united, and we can have a debate about how far we support particular tax breaks for particular types of relationships. But at the end of the day, it's not really the government's job to be involved in those areas. Really, the government's job is to sort out health and education.
Do you think, Olga Maitland, the party should make some kind of decisive break with the Margaret Thatcher legacy?
No, I think we should be proud of her. I think one of the great sadnesses is hearing the remark that somehow or other she's an embarrassment. She's not. She's part of our great history. However, life evolves. We move on. We carry the best of her heritage with us, and we develop a new generation of ideas and energy, which has been coming out of the conference right now, and you will see it a year from in the future. But Margaret Thatcher was a tremendous figure in history, modern history. The Labour Party talk about her. Tony Blair has a great admiration for her. Why should we be anything other than proud
What's her
of her?
place, do you think?
Well, she's the leader before last. I think it's ridiculous to
that's it.
keep fetishising Margaret Thatcher as either a great icon or a great failure. People have different views. We've now got to focus on the future. I personally think she was right for her times and did a tremendous job, and we are proud of that. But we are now in the year 2001. We've got a new agenda. We've got a new set of problems to tackle. But what we can do is take on board some of the honesty and some of the passion that she exhibited, and we now apply those to health and education. We apply those to pensions, and we go honestly to the public and say, this is what we believe, this is why we believe it. It's based on care, it's based on concern for the things that matter to you, and we're going to deliver on that. She did it then, we can do it now, but it's a different country, and we've got new issues.
Did it worry you, Olga Maitland, watching the pictures there of William Hague and Ian Duncan Smith together? The physical similarities between them do tend to suggest that there's actually some kind of political continuum there, isn't there? And that actually there may not be a fresh start or a clean break.
Do you know, funnily enough, they may have a similarity because they both are rather thin on top.
They're pretty right-wing as well.
Well, that's not really the point. The point is actually Ian is going to be running a very different agenda. A year from now, you will find him leading a team which is very coherent with its ideas. It'll be very positive in making a huge effort to get a radical program on board. This will come strongly from him. Also, his straightforwardness, he's brisk, he's businesslike. He doesn't go in for public antics. He doesn't go in for spin. And the public are fed up of spin.
All right. Olga Maitland, Paul Ray, thank you both very much indeed. And Jeremy, back to you.
Well, thank you. In a moment, I'll look at tomorrow's newspapers, but before that, a roundup of today's news. Our main story tonight, Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda group has said that hijacked plane attacks on the United States would continue and that it won't cease its battle, as it called it, against America until America withdraws from Muslim lands. Meanwhile, the Pentagon has been showing reconnaissance photos of the damage its airstrikes have inflicted on the airfields and military assets of the Taliban. Well, I'm joined now on the telephone by our political editor, Martha Carney, who is in a plane. Where are you going, Martha?
I'm on a plane travelling from Geneva to the Middle East with the Prime Minister. I can't tell you exactly where we're going for security reasons, but he's just stopped off in Geneva where he had a meeting with Sheikh Zayed of the United Arab Emirates. And I think the whole point of this mission to the Middle East is to try and reassure the Arab world that the military action is being taken not as the West against Islam, but as part of the fight against terrorism. And they particularly wanted to talk to Sheikh Zayed because the UEA was one of the few countries that actually had diplomatic relations with the Taliban. and has also had a reputation for having problems with money laundering in the area. But what's of particular interest tonight, I think, is an interview that the Prime Minister has given to Abu Dhabi television, and this spells out some of the dilemmas that he has in this visit. Because you may remember the United States yesterday talked about the option of leaving open the option of action against other countries, and that people interpreted that as meaning action against Iraq. The Prime Minister tonight refused to rule out action against other countries, although he did say that what we're talking about is two phases. The first is the direct military action against the Al-Qaeda network and in the aftermath of the attack of September 11th. A second phase is much more long-term, and he said that in those circumstances we would only consider action against countries when there was evidence of aiding and abetting international terrorism, and also any action would only be taken in consultation with allies, particular allies in the Arab world.
Martha, thanks very much indeed. Rail Tracks to go to the High Court tomorrow to try to recover £350 million of its frozen assets. The company wants to secure the money for its shareholders, who've been told they risk losing everything they've invested. The chairman of Rail Track, John Robinson, has turned down an offer from the government to head the new company, which will take over the rail network. Fragments resembling part of a Ukrainian missile have been found in the wreckage of the plane that came down over the Black Sea last week. Russian investigators say the discovery supports the theory that the airliner was shot down during a military exercise. 78 passengers and crew were killed in the accident. Plaid Cymru has become the first main the main UK political parties to call for an end to the bombing in Afghanistan. The party leader, Ian Wyn-Jones, says the airstrike should stop immediately and that political negotiations should resume in order to avoid a humanitarian disaster. It was a quiet day on the markets. The FT 100 share index was down. In New York, the Dow Jones was also down against the pound. The euro was up, and against the dollar, sterling was down. Tomorrow morning's front pages, the Daily Mail, the anthrax nightmare. The Daily Telegraph has news of that spin doctor we were talking about earlier, September the 11th. She said was a good day to bury bad news, and the news further down the page below the fold that Kate Adie, this is the Telegraph which you're looking at now, that Kate Adie has apparently disclosed the Prime Minister's itinerary in the Middle East. Allies prepare to send in their troops. The Independent, the Times, manhunt from the skies, that reconnaissance battle damage photograph. War about to enter new phase on the front page of The Guardian. In the Financial Times, US unveils results of bombing campaign, and The Sun, sacked Kate Adie for apparently saying where the Prime Minister was going on his plane trip. That's all from Newsnight tonight. There's a round-the-clock news coverage on BBC News 24. I'll be back with more tomorrow. Until then, though, from all of us on the programme, good night.
Hello there. Despite a brief respite from the wind and rain today, there is more unsettled weather on the way, particularly Thursday and Friday in the north and the west. Gale force winds returning, but in the south it's set to warm up. At this time of year, temperatures normally reach around 15 degrees in London, 10 in Lerwick. It's in the south especially where we'll see the warming. See that warm air spilling northwards across England and Wales, and the temperatures lifting to the high teens and the low 20s by the early part of the weekend. However, for Scotland and Northern Ireland, certainly through Wednesday and Thursday, it'll be more unsettled. These weather fronts already coming in off the Atlantic, bringing some rain towards Northern Ireland and Western Scotland. Will slip southwards, coming across high pressure. They will weaken as they reach the south, but by the end of tomorrow, the next low is winding itself up towards the northwest of Scotland. Wet and windy weather, coupled with that area of low pressure, another one following closely on its heels. So it is going to be particularly wet in some areas. We could see a couple of inches of rain in northern and western parts of Scotland, for example, coupled with gale force winds, so particularly unsettled autumnal weather. So it's here we expect most of the rain through Thursday and Friday. It's further south through England and Wales where we're expecting a little bit drier conditions, a little bit of brightness and even a little bit of warm sunshine, particularly by Friday. For Wednesday, however, our weather front will have slipped southwards into parts of northern England, northern and western Wales by the morning. Drier, brighter weather will be following on behind, and after early mistiness in the south, it should be a fairly bright start to the day, some hazy sunshine, but that's not set to last. Come the afternoon, we see a reversal of roles. Cloudier and quite damp in the south, brighter with some sunshine further north and just a few showers. But a windy day for many, strong to gale force winds in the north, gusty winds tempering the feel, and we will find the next batch of wet and windy weather soon arriving in the northwest through tomorrow night. So a wet day here on Thursday, Heavier rain coming and going, strong to gale force winds. Drier further south away from the coast, that is, with a little bit of warm sunshine, but more so on Friday, although by then the threat of some showers in the far south.
Hey, Fred, have a look at this.
Animals! So what are they fighting about now?
TV licence.
TV licence?
Yeah, which one's going to pay it?
Oh, that's got to hurt.
Not really. It could be just a smidge over £9 a month when you pay by direct debit.
Not that Dino or Rex would know that. Brains the size of peas. Come on, love. Oh, get her.
Don't be a dinosaur. There's an easier way to pay for your TV licence. Direct debit. Call now for details on 0800 328 2020.
Meet the lads. Gus.
That's the master at work, boy. He won't even bother with coffee. He won't even know what's here.
Ferris.
Trust me, this is a good one.
Linville.
Linville Henry, a photographer.
And Johnny.
Solomon, 700 wives, yeah? And he sorted every last one of them.
Baby Father, a new 4-part drama starts tomorrow at 9 on BBC Two.